So greetings and welcome to our final day, the 2025 National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Our theme for this week's event was enhancing North American biosecurity to protect against invasive species. My name is Christy Trifone Millhouse, your NISAW Executive Director. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. We're excited to have all of you joining us. And as I mentioned, please feel free to find the chat box and share where you're joining from. Also, after our presentation today, please feel free to use the reaction button to let our presenter know that you enjoyed today's topic. And we will be hosting a brief Q&A after the webinar. So find the Q&A box and pop your questions in there. Should you add a question to the chat box, we won't be able to answer that. So please do find Q&A box to add questions. NISAW is an international event powered by the North American Invasive Species Management Association, as referred to as NISAW, to raise awareness about invasive species, the threat they pose, and what can be done to prevent their spread. NISAW provides a platform for individuals from state, local, federal, tribal agencies, regional organizations, private industry, and citizens to discuss legislation, policies, resources, and improvements that can be made with our elected officials and decision makers. This has been a week not only for learning, but for action. I'm sure each of you have taken time to fill out a muster. We've been sharing links throughout the week in an effort to connect you with your U.S. senators and House representative. So if you haven't taken action, there is still time, and we'll share with you some of those links at the end of this presentation. You can also find them on our socials. We want our representatives to hear our collective voice and to learn about the importance of this work and why we need support and funding to continue to move forward. For those who still want to take a more active role this week, please head to NISAW.org and find our NISAW toolkit with template social posts, press releases, PSAs, and more. If you're connected to us on socials, please keep sharing updates and information. And if you're not currently connected to us, please find us. The agenda this week has been incredible. Presentations have focused on our theme of enhancing biosecurity at all levels. Our presentations yesterday highlighted all the work that our partners at the Army Corps of Engineers are taking on related to biosecurity. We encourage you to visit our website to register for the few remaining webinars we have going on today. And if you weren't able to attend any of our events this week, we'll be posting them on our YouTube channel after the event. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our agenda has changed quite a bit over this last month and continued to change most of this week. Appreciate your patience and understanding. I'd like to take a moment to thank those federal employees who have invested their energy and time and heart into this work. Some of you are no longer with us leading these efforts, while others are still holding strong. NISAW is driven, as I mentioned, by education and action. And as a partner, we recognize that now is not the time to take a step back and sit down, but rather to stand up and move forward together. So I encourage you to activate your networks behind our calls to action and to provide support to programs in your area that need a bit of glue right now in any way that you can. Through partnership and collaboration, we are stronger. And this is really the essence of NISAW. As leaders of NISAW, NISAW is deeply vested in our mission to empower invasive species management across North America. We are led by an 18-member board of leading experts and professionals with supporting committees that I encourage you all to check out and join, a strong NISAW team, and a membership that continues to grow in numbers by the day. NISAW is one of our most far-reaching events, with over 2.9 million people participating in last year's event. Here at NISAW, we provide the connection, tools, and voice you need to address invasive species. We frame our programming around these three core pillars, and we work hard to provide opportunities for collaboration and connection through webinars, summits, in-person annual conference, we equip our membership and those in the community with the tools needed to manage and educate the public about invasive species. And finally, we strive to provide that collective voice on a national platform to advocate for relevance and support through our government relations programming and events like today's NISAW. Some of our upcoming events you won't want to miss. The National 2025 Forum on Biological Control in Annapolis, Maryland, from April 14th through the 17th. The meeting themes revolve around biocontrol research, management, and impacts in natural areas. We have some great speakers lined up, so I encourage you to register today if you're interested in this in-person networking opportunity with members from our biocontrol community. Another event you won't want to miss is the 2025 NISMA Annual Conference. Mark your calendars, folks, and plan to join us in Lake Tahoe from November 3rd through the 6th. Our theme this year is charting a new course, and we've got some great speakers lined up already and hope to see you there. Head to NISMA.org to register today. So one of the ways that we creatively fund our mission-driven work here at NISMA is through our NISMA online shop. And this week we're hosting a special to celebrate NISAW related to our handheld boot brushes. So make sure you head to the NISMA shop, order those brushes, and maybe there's some other tools there that you'd like to make a purchase. Every purchase does go to supporting NISMA and our programming. As a friendly reminder, your membership dues help to make our mission come to life. If you're not currently a member, we offer a variety of different membership options, and you can view these on our website at nisma.org. This year, we've unveiled a new sponsor program, our Premier Partner Program. Premier partners enjoy benefits throughout the year, including acknowledgement on our website, at events, and many other opportunities. So check that out. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our 2025 Premier partners who generously made NISAW and many other NISMA events possible. All right. It's now time for our main event. I'd like to introduce NISMA's Government Relations Manager, Mara Cunningham, who will be moderating our webinar today. Mara?
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Christy said, I'm Mara Cunningham. I'm NISMA's Government Relations Manager. I'll be helping moderate our session today. Our webinar is titled Operationalizing Collective Action for Pandemics, Ecosystems, and Community Resilience in 45 Countries, One Health, Sustainable Development Goals, and the OSMART tool. We will be hearing from Dr. Katey Pelican, who is Director of Strategic Partnership and Research Collaborative and co-lead Systemwide University of Minnesota Sustainable Development Goals Initiative. For everyone watching, if you could be sure to put any comments or questions in the Q&A box and we can answer at the end of our session. And Katey, if you would like to share your slides now.
Thank you, Mara and team. So I really appreciate having an opportunity to talk to you all. I have done a lot of work with pandemics, but a little bit less work with invasive species. So I'm excited to engage this community and think about ways that some of the big challenges that are being faced around invasive species can be sort of looked at through a One Health lens. So I'm Katey Pelican. I know we didn't have a long introduction, but so I thought I would spend a little time talking about my background. I'm actually a wildlife veterinarian by training. I always have wildlife in my background, and this for you guys is an invasive species in the place I am soon going. So I'm about to start a position actually at the University of Hawaii. So a place that is acutely aware of some of the challenges with invasive species and always under threat by them. So mongoose is one of the invasive species that's currently causing problems in the islands. I started life as a wildlife veterinarian, was hired by the University of Minnesota to start an ecosystem health program. And I've basically moved more and more into wrangling people with my career. So I currently direct an office that I started called SPARK, Strategic Partnership and Research Collaborative. I co-lead a Sustainable Development Goal initiative, and I'll talk a little bit about that, less about SPARK. And I'm moving into a new position, which is a Health Sciences Institute with a very holistic understanding of what health and well-being means at the University of Hawaii. I have done this work in 45 countries, not all personally, some of it through partners, supporting partners to do the work. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples of work I've done and some of the lessons learned with that in this talk today. So the work I do has been under two major frameworks. There are some variations of One Health, but the first is the One Health approach. One Health is a growing framework around the world, especially for governments. This is the definition that what they now call the quadripartite, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the United Nations Environmental Program came up with as defining basically collaborative, integrative approaches to health at the intersection of animals, humans, and the environment. And a lot of people touch this elephant differently. And there's also other names for this intersection and issues at this intersection: ecosystem health, planetary health. I'm a lumper, not a splitter. So to me, it's all about collaborative action to address some of the big challenges in the world. And that has actually brought me to working with the Sustainable Development Goals. For me, SDGs are really a framework for thinking about One Health challenges, or these very complex challenges that we are facing around the world, including, I would argue, invasive species. So SDGs are basically, if everyone closed their eyes and listed the biggest challenges in the world, they'd be pretty close to this list of 16 goals plus partnerships, which is really an approach to dealing with those goals. So that's how I think about Sustainable Development Goals: is all of them are integrated, all of them are related to each other. We can't think about invasive species without thinking about the challenges related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of the lessons I've learned in this work are, I think we see that threats are arising, and these threats are more and more complex, and that no one agency is responsible for them. I think invasive species is a great example of this. No one agency has responsibility, no one sector, so government, industry, public, private, academics, all have to work together to address these challenges. And we're not really prepared to do that well. And so that's been a lot of my work. The challenges we face are what I call horizontal among agencies that might be at the same level of civil society or sectors. So health, agriculture, wildlife work, tourism, finance, all these groups that have their own mission spaces have to work together, and there's challenges in integrating that. This figure came from, I'll talk a little bit later about this OSMART tool that I developed in collaboration with USDA. And this was sort of the outcome of the first analysis we did, is, looking at pandemics, many agencies are involved. This was an avian influenza outbreak in the, mid-teens. And no one agency knows all the other groups that are involved. So it's a complex system, and no one really is understanding the whole complexity. These challenges are also vertical. This is actually a figure I got from someone at the UN who deals with Sustainable Development Goals. So a lot of these goals are set at a national level. And the integration, the actual action and impact happens at a local level. But there's very few systems that integrate down. nations or even intergovernmental agencies struggle with integrating with nations, struggle with integrating with states or provinces, struggle to integrate with communities or in institutions at a local level. So, I think we all, I used to have to explain this a lot, and, all of us have now lived through a disruption that has us all understand it a little better, right? We all understand now that what started out as a public health emergency with COVID soon became an emergency that covered many bases and was, an international emergency and a community institution emergency. It was, a job emergency and a transportation emergency, etc. Another lesson learned is that, these local crises, as I've worked around the globe, are shared locally. They have a different flavor as you move from the poorest county in Minnesota, Monoman County, where climate change is having impact on important tribal cultural items like wild rice and food items like wild rice. And hunger is an issue that has to do with lack of access to food or good food. Whereas the poorest district in Rwanda, climate change and hunger look different, but there's a lot of things that are shared. And similarly, in a small island state like Fiji, climate change and hunger have a different flavor, but they're present and important and priorities for the communities. And I guess the last lesson learned for me has been that higher education has an important role to play and doesn't always fulfill that role well. So we can be catalysts for action in higher education. I supported a USAID project that worked with 97 universities in 17 countries in places as diverse as DR Congo and Malaysia. And, places like DR Congo, universities are among the most stable institutions that they have. The universities we worked with had been around for 50, 70 years. And, no government has lasted that long in DR Congo. We also represent a broad expertise. We have neutral convening power. We have the ability to work across borders and partner with many different sectors in ways that government agencies couldn't, private sector couldn't. But again, we're not always great at doing this. I just think we have the power to do it if we can mobilize ourselves. So with all this work and this understanding, I have worked with a growing toolbox of tools that I wanted to talk to you about today. None of these are perfect and none of them are an answer. Or they can be, but they can support collaborative action. So I guess the first is really a framework that I increasingly work with and I come back to over and over again. This is a paper that a graduate student of mine and a colleague of mine created from doing a qualitative analysis of the literature around what works and doesn't work for collaborations for zoonotic disease. And what she found was that there are sort of three categories of factors that contribute to successful collaboration. There's individual factors. So individuals need to have the skills, competencies, and relationships to be successful in fostering collaboration. There's organizational factors. Each organization involved has to have systems in place, structures in place, the people to be able to collaborate effectively. And then there's enabling conditions, which is the collaboration among the network and the systems that support collaboration among those organizations and among those individuals. And, to me, this has almost become like a change model. In order to create collaborative systems, we have to think about these different levels of factors that are important for collaboration to be effective. And that change model might be at a nation level, it might be at a state level, but it also could be at an individual level. With those individual factors, we, and with the USAID work that I did, we started thinking about, well, how can we create individuals at a nation level that can support this kind of collaborative work? And so that came to this framework for our One Health workforce. Typically, workforce is thought about from a sector level. So the health sector will create a workforce plan for the health sector, and the ag group will create a workforce plan for ag. But you all know, as invasive species folks, the folks that deal with invasive species will cut across sectors. And so if we think at a nation level about what workforce needs to be in place for addressing invasive species, we can't just think one sector at a time. We really have to think about the whole system. So that's where this framework came in, where we have people with technical competence to do the work. They also have multi-sectoral skills to be able to collaborate effectively among all the sectors that are involved. And then they need an enabling environment that allows the agencies and the organizations and the individuals to be able to collaborate effectively. With that development of this workforce framework or this workforce model, I have gotten very involved. I and many colleagues have gotten quite involved in really thinking about practice-based competency development. So what skills do that workforce need to be competent, both in the technical skills and in the multi-sectoral skills, so that they are able to effectively do the work? And I am a believer in understanding what skills people need on the ground, not necessarily theoretical. What do they use every day? And what do they need to be really competent every day? And that doesn't always meet the disciplinary requirements, right? Of what like a vet school might expect you to graduate with, or a medical school might expect you to graduate. You do a lot of things on the ground that aren't necessarily part of your formal training. And so I'm interested in that question. How can you be more effective in your work day to day that's useful to you as a professional or as a part of this multi-sectoral system? One of the big tools that I developed, I've already mentioned, the OSMART tool. It was in my title. OSMART means One Health Systems Mapping and Analysis Resource Toolkit. It's basically a suite of tools that come from business and social science, mostly, that support collaborative decision-making and action planning in complex systems. So the toolkit includes 6 steps with tools associated with them. The first is a stakeholder mapping tool that I I adapted from one of the faculty in our policy school, which looks at not just who the stakeholders are in the system, and we'll slice them based on different, sometimes we do this, which is more civil society, local, national, regional, international. Sometimes we'll look at them for like a value chain. We might look at all the steps in the value chain. So you can kind of slice the pie a little differently depending on what system you're looking at. But one of the key parts of it is we don't just look at what the stakeholders are, who they are, but also influence in the system. So where is money flowing? How are decisions being made? So we begin to understand who the kind of core influencers are in the system. The second thing we do is interviews, and those interviews might be focus groups. We are increasingly using more qualitative analysis for these interviews so that we begin to understand what themes are emerging in a more systematic way. But really what we're trying to understand with these interviews is how organizations are functioning in the system, what I call actors. So an actor may be a whole organization, but it also could be a piece of an organization. So for example, in pandemic work, laboratories function differently than epidemiology departments. And those really function separately as actors because they might be as siloed as, the public health lab from the agricultural lab. And so you begin to understand, who the actors are in the system, why they're functioning the way they function, who they're already collaborating with, what's working, not working. Those are the kinds of questions we're asking. And then the heart and soul of this work is a collaborative process mapping exercise that we do. Process mapping has been used in business for many years, really to look at efficiency. We use it quite differently. We use it as a collaborative decision-making tool. So multiple agencies sit around a table and they collaboratively map out what actually happens on the ground. And then as they do that, based on different scenarios, and scenarios are very high level. So this is a map of antibiotic production, distribution, and fate in Laos, Cambodia. And so as they map, they identify what we call discrepancies. Those are the stars on this map. Discrepancies are places where there's confusion, there's conflict, or maybe a system just doesn't exist and should. So example on this map is if we look at this upper left-hand corner, that's the black market for antibiotics. So it's kind of one big discrepancy. Where are they coming from? Where are they going? That's sort of one example of a discrepancy. Then once you have these discrepancies and you've these different agencies have identified places that are sticking in the system in that way, they'll then go back in the final 3 steps to resolve those discrepancies, like what should happen for each of those. So for example, for the black market, we should know where they're coming from. We should know where they're going, who's distributing, all those questions. And then you create an action to address, like a solution. So we should know who's they're coming from. And the solution might be, we need to do an analysis, an action to address that. So we need to do a risk analysis for the black market for drugs. And then you assign who. So you do this collaborative action planning exercise as part of this OSMART based on those discrepancies that you find together collaboratively. This tool has been used. It is a recommended tool by the quadripartite that I mentioned earlier as part of a suite of work around zoonotic disease. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We have used it in 29 countries at different levels of civil society for different clients. I'll give some examples of this later. But it's basically a very flexible tool for supporting this kind of collaborative decision-making and system strengthening. The Sustainable Development Goals, I mentioned I use it as a framework for sort of thinking about sort of an integrative way or agreed to framework for thinking about who needs to be at the table and what we need to think about in terms of addressing these complex challenges like invasive species. And I'll just, so now I almost use it as a tool itself. So this is just one way I've been doing that, is taking, so SDGs, if you're not familiar with them, are broken into goals. No poverty is one goal. And then they have targets for that, and then they have indicators. So I tend to take the target level and I'll think about or map out what needs to happen for this challenge that we're facing around the targets for poverty. This is an example of a mapping I actually did for cancer. So, how does poverty relate to cancer? Well, people in extreme poverty have a higher risk for cancer. They also have a less capacity or less access to healthcare to deal with cancer, et cetera. So I'll go down and think through like, okay, how does invasive species relate to poverty? How does it relate to hunger, et cetera? This is sort of a map I created actually for this new position that I'm going into, the Health Sciences Institute at Hawaii. So how do the SDGs relate to health and well-being of communities in Hawaii? And so I went through this exercise to think for myself, who do I need to engage and how do I need to think about health and well-being in Hawaii related to this SDGs? So I just wanted to give you some examples of how I view some of these tools in my career, and then I'll end with some thoughts on how this might be applicable to invasive species. And then I hope to just have a conversation with you a little bit about how you feel it could be important to your work with invasive species. So I like to think about systems and this sort of levels of civil society. You've seen it several times in this talk already. To me is just a way to break down a complex system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I've done at these different levels of civil society, and what I've learned from that work. And then I'll move into talking a little bit about how I see opportunity with invasive species. So in terms of intergovernmental One Health systems or working at the intergovernmental level, the work I did with USAID, I ran USAID projects for 10 years, pandemic threats projects, was all under a framework called the Global Health Security Agenda. It still exists. It's changed forms a few times since it was first launched in 2014. But ultimately, it's about a world safe and secure from global health threats, particularly around infectious diseases. This work was originally framed as having action packages, and then countries were supposed to create roadmaps. So it was quite an extensive package of work. Countries signed on to it, and there was a external assessment, or a JEE, joint external evaluation, that countries underwent to determine whether they have made progress or not. And so, it was this sort of package of work that was created at the national level that nations agreed to strengthen systems for infectious disease. These were the original action packages that we started work under. These again adjusted even as I was working on them over the next 10 years, or 5 years from 2014. And now, they've morphed a bit again. This then led to these UN agencies creating frameworks. They created this guidance, which I contributed to, for zoonotic disease in countries. So there's this guidebook where they are recommending action for countries. So again, countries are kind of signing on to do this very, to fulfill these requirements that are multi-sectoral, they're complex. I worked with a number of colleagues in the US government and the UN to write this paper, which helped because a whole bunch of tools came out to help countries do this work, which were sort of offered to countries, sometimes with money, sometimes without money. And so this paper was supposed to help them understand how all these various tools that were being created might work together to help them achieve a stronger One Health system. You'll see OSMART is in this mix, among a variety of other tools. And I think what we found, like this, you saw, and I'll talk a little bit more about this antimicrobial resistance mapping that we did that was under requirements under the Global Health Security Agenda. That these countries sign on to goals, these tools can help them, but there's also often a lot of confusion and a very mixed bag in terms of how countries can uptake this. And then a lot of all these things happen in the national level, and there's this sort of understanding that things are not reaching the local level. And so I think that's one of the important takeaways is like action happens locally, invasive species happen locally. Setting national goals is important, but not sufficient to actually get to action at the local level. We then supported a variety of more tool creation for countries, in collaboration with some countries. UN process is very intensive in terms of making sure countries have opportunity to contribute. But again, for the most part, these tools have not reached that local level of action. And then it was interesting coming into sustainable development goals because there's a lot of the similar things that were happening with SDGs. Countries sign on to achieve SDGs. There's as a voluntary review, like a assessment that countries can do or not. Most of them have elected to do it. But again, action, poverty, hunger, these things happen at a local level. And how do we achieve that local action? What's been interesting too for me is that these high-level UN goals, which work with nations, for the most part, they're not working below the national level unless nations allow them to or encourage them to, is I've also been involved in some intergovernmental or international work that was driven by not quite so global entities. So one of the groups I've worked with quite a lot has been the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is all the countries, so there's definitely that national level question that surround the Arctic. But it also involves some local actors, particularly indigenous associations and groups that represent the indigenous peoples of that region. And with that came some more emphasis on local problems. So for example, I hosted a workshop in Norway in a couple of years ago that was hosted by the Norwegian government. And they elected to focus on avian influenza, which is a very typical thing we've worked on as a national issue, but they also wanted to have a scenario that was focused on reindeer declines, which is a much more local issue in many ways for this regional workshop around that was Pan-Arctic. And then even more local, I also supported one tribe in Minnesota, and an association, a moose association, that they were hosting a conference, a moose conference in Grand Portage, Minnesota, which is way up north near Canada. And with that, they hosted this co-stewardship of moose workshop that involved this incredible diverse group of actors, including government agencies from both Canada, both national and provincial government agencies from Canada, both national and state agencies from multiple states in the United States, plus 12 tribal organizations, both across the border, and industry partners and non-governmental partners and others. And so they were able to host this intergovernmental workshop under conditions that were much less formal than I'd worked with the UN or even with the Arctic Council. And we published this paper that laid out core principles for indigenous co-stewardship of moose. And so I think there's opportunity in this that I'm seeing, where you can kind of come at it from both directions, right? These very formalized UN interactions and these much more locally focused question workshops that might be more grassroots and convene diverse actors in a different way. So some of my lessons from this intergovernmental work include that, these national governments, they're signing on to these goals and agreements that are very challenging for them to meet, especially because their systems are very siloed, that, they require these very complex systems and agreements and requirements, need agreement among ministries, sectors, organizations, and the tools that are available to them and to do that aren't always clear to them, aren't always easily available to them. But they, there's this increasing availability of these One Health tools, there are tools available to help them be collaborative in how they approach these challenges. Sometimes it's confusing how to work, implement them together to get the different groups that are offering the tools to work together to implement them. And, I think there is this issue still of like national level goals not reaching where they really need to meet, especially when they're coming through these very formalized channels of the UN agencies, national government systems to reach that local level. But what I'm seeing is that there are opportunities for that local level to be conveners also, and that those convenings end up having kind of a different focus and a different look and feel that really tend to address those local issues. So in terms of national One Health systems, just a couple of examples of work I've done with that. I mentioned that I worked with FAO on national antimicrobial resistance action planning for Laos and Cambodia in Southeast Asia. This was driven by these UN goals. So this was an example where a country said, okay, I've signed on to this, I need help. They asked FAO to help them, and then FAO asked us to contribute the One Health tool to this workshop. So that's one way I think that nations take on this collaborative interagency collaborative decision making, is that they have these national goals that they recognize need collaborative systems, and they can then implement some decision making tools at the national level. And that's certainly how this happened with the Laos Cambodia AMR action planning. I also mentioned this One Health workforce question of like a workforce to address One Health challenges cuts across many sectors. And so one of the things we did with, and in general, those sectors are creating their own workforce plans. There is no national workforce necessarily for pandemic threats, for invasive species. And so we did use the OSMART tool to host workforce planning in 9 countries in Africa that had this more multi-sectoral approach to workforce, where we did the mapping based on zoonotic disease priorities that had come out of the zoonotic disease prioritization tool from CDC. And as we build those maps, we then asked these teams to look at those maps and think about what skills those actors in the system need in order to do their job well. Because what's unique about these maps is that these are the spaces between agencies. Often those relationships are not formalized, and those actions that collaborate among are not formalized. And so, and often the position descriptions for the people that are doing that collaborative work don't include that collaborative element, right? So really try to think through, how do we make the system stronger through that individual factor and organizational factor question of having the skills and competencies in the system to support the work. And so we ended up creating this dashboards for countries about where they needed workforce support across agencies, not really necessarily messing with the health workforce requirements, the ag workforce requirements that were more technical, more thinking about the system and strengthening it, that's across the agencies. So some of the lessons from national work is that these countries are very siloed in general and how they think about dealing with challenges. I think I'm sure you understand that coming from an invasive species perspective, that there's the role that each agency plays, and they don't even often understand the role other agencies play. They might have personal connections that allow them to work together collaboratively, but as an organization or agency, they struggle with all the roles and responsibilities of all the other agencies. And so creating a multi-sectoral approach really requires everyone to see the system together and understand it, and then think about ways to strengthen it. And the kinds of silos we see really are similar across all the different work, all the different OSMARTs, all the different work I've done in all the countries, especially with OSMART, the OSMART tool. There's challenges with communications, that most of the connections among agencies are ad hoc, and lack formalized relationships. That certainly finances are a huge barrier. Who gets the money makes a big difference in terms of how things are handled. And because of that, sort of the systems are only as weak as sort of the poorest, least resourced agency that's in the system. So, in terms of subnational work, so as we move down through the levels of civil society, some things are the same and some things are different, I would say. At the state level, I've worked both with state agencies, subnational agencies, or sub-state agencies, and also other sectors. So this is an example of work I did with another sector. I supported the Nature Conservancy, who had received money from USDA to start a climate smart seed and seedling production network in the state of Minnesota. Effectively, it was a reforestation planning team. And so we supported them to do basically a market analysis of all the stakeholders, do interviews, and then convene tribes, government agencies, nonprofits, all of whom, farmers and farmers associations who are involved in the reforestation value chain, effectively, to make a plan for how to strengthen that value chain. I've also looked at, and for that, I think that was that was an exercise in multi-sectoralism, right? Led by an unusual actor, at least from the perspective of the Formalized Systems, which is a nonprofit, and more grassroots in its impact. I also looked at COVID animal surveillance, and with that, really was thinking about that vertical chain, and how it actually affects local action. So with that, we did interviews of federal, state, and local organizations, both government and non-governmental. So for example, at the local level, we interviewed a bunch of, quite a couple, well, not a bunch, a couple of rehab organizations who are very affected by COVID animal cases. And so with that, and then we convened a group like that, just for a half day to kind of look at the map and think about ways that could be strengthened. And really it broke down by the different types of animals that we were talking about. So free-ranging wildlife had its own group of actors, its own group of roles, responsibilities, challenges, kept wildlife, which is really zoos and rehab, farmed animals, all of which were affected in this, had some issues that were related, but some of their own issues, and then companion animals, again, which really have very little regulatory agencies involved. A lot of that had to do with just no one being truly responsible for those animals. And then sort of finally was a work with emergency response systems that were more at the county level. So often emergency responses run at the state level, and then county emergency response has to feed in, especially with agricultural emergency response like we see here. So it kind of reversed what typically happens, where local response is often responsible. Here, the state was responsible. So we really looked at how that functioned well, or not. And ultimately, we found 75 actors involved at this sort of county to state interaction, actually municipal to county to state interaction. many of whom, again, weren't necessarily aware of each other and some of the challenges they were facing. And each sector had its own concerns, right? So communication was an issue locally. Things like mental health really rose to the top of concern, which was less of a issue from a state perspective or a national perspective. The roles that counties played were really highlighted from the county's perspective that, again, the state wasn't necessarily aware of. So, and again, I think this is something we find often. Prior relationships are important, those enabling conditions, that there was a good incident command, but there were also opportunities for improvement, that these vertical systems weren't necessarily functioning smoothly, and that many people that could have been mobilized weren't mobilized because they were marginalized in the actions. So from a subnational work perspective, this is where work happens. This is where One Health challenges actually hit the ground. And so there's a lot of connections that would make the system more efficient that aren't being taken advantage of. And that there are also many challenges that other sectors, I think, could effectively address, and may be doing so, but aren't necessarily recognized by the system, like we saw with the Nature Conservancy. And I do think that this is a place where universities can play an important role because of our convening power, the ability to convene the county, the municipal, the tribal nations, the state, and the national government, to have that conversation on neutral terms. Community One Health systems are kind of we haven't done a lot of this. This is the example I'm using is with during the pandemic, we worked with the White Earth Ojibwe Tribal College to support community-based planning around food sovereignty. And, they were facing a real crisis in food security in their community and really needed help. They asked for help. I was running a network I'll talk about a little later. They requested help from the university. And with that, we created a partnership-based approach to working with the tribal college as our primary partner in the community, to use OSMART as a tool for food sovereignty action planning. Very quickly it became clear that it couldn't be just applied, right? It really needed to be combined with more community appropriate approaches. So our tribal partners brought their own tool to the table, the Circle tool. We also brought in a tool from environmental planning called structured decision making that allowed the community to define what they meant by food sovereignty, so that we could create a kind of a collaborative understanding of what was meant by food sovereignty as sort of the goal of the OSMART. And then we used some of the tools around OSMART to support community-based decision making. I think what was notable to me in that adaptation of the tool is that it really has to be driven by the needs of the community and by the Circle tool. The first part of the Circle tool is trust building, and that at the community level, trust is probably the most important commodity you consider, and in terms of enabling conditions, building that first is the most important thing. So we really prolonged the engagement at the front end of what really wasn't the OSMART tool in the end. It was really a collaborative approach. And in order to really understand where the community was, before we began to think about collaborative action. And then the other part of this was that at that community level, particularly in a community like the White Earth Tribe, there's a lot of historic sort of traumatic relationships that needed to be really taken into consideration, that you can't just convene and expect things to go well. There's too many power dynamics and sort of traumatic interrelationships that were important to consider as we progressed through the process. So lessons from community-based work are the marginalized communities and nations have been poorly served, continue to be poorly served, and so the trust building is very important. That participatory approaches are needed to allow the community to define the problem for themselves, and don't make assumptions. I think I'm going to skim through, I might actually just go to this, which is from an institutional perspective. I've taken all of this into account as I've built, co-led this Sustainable Development Goal Initiative, that universities have an important role to play, and we need systems that can mobilize university resources for this kind of problem-solving, solutions-based work. And so that's really how the SDG initiative has been framed at the University of Minnesota. We've worked across all the major pillars of work at the university to orient the university more towards this kind of problem-solving work. There's many resources for invasive species to consider in that. And so I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about was how I would see this working for invasive species and sort of my somewhat ignorant perspective. I mean, I've worked with pandemics, which I know are invasive species of their own, but every invasive species is its own monster. I did support with the Spark work, strategic planning for the Invasive Species Center, MASRIC, Aquatic Invasive Species Center at the University of Minnesota. And so some of this is informed by that work as well. The state of Minnesota, it's a mosaic, right? There are many funders, there are many actors, there are many, and those exist at all levels of civil society, as we've talked about. There's power dynamics, there's trust dynamics, as with all One Health challenges. So I do think it's a ripe area for thinking about how do we support better vertical and horizontal systems for addressing invasive species. I know some of that already happens. The association that's hosting this webinar is already thinking about these things and doing these things, but it's certainly, to me, a great example of a One Health challenge. I did do a quick mapping, as we had talked about, of SDGs against invasive species. And, I do think it works. Some maybe better than others, but, certainly poverty, hunger, energy, infrastructure. These are all things that there's a relationship with invasive species and addressing invasive species in terms of moving forward with solutions. So with that, I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I'm not seeing questions in the Q&A box. If anybody has them, we can maybe answer them offline, or they can email you with those questions. Oh, just got one. Could you re-show the last slide?
Yes. Hold on. I assume this one or the previous one? This one?
Sure. And maybe the last one as well, just in case. With contact info. Okay, great. All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up then and move on to our call to action. Thank you again, Dr. Pelican, and thank you everybody for attending.
You?
Yeah. So we like to end these information sharing sessions with our call to action, which today we're asking you to send a letter to your federal representatives in the House and the Senate, asking to reauthorize a complete farm bill The 2018 Farm Bill has been given a 1-year extension through September 30th of this year, but it's missing many of the original key provisions for invasive species management that were present in the original bill. So make sure our legislators create and pass a fully funded 5-year Farm Bill as it was intended. You can either scan that QR code or follow the link in the chat. You can input your information and it'll send a letter to your representatives. All right, and then we do just have one more webinar for our NISAW closing out the week. So be sure to go to nisaw.org and register. We hope to see you there. And thank you all again for attending. And thank you, Katey, for your time today.